Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Adam Bulley. Adam is a postdoc fellow at the Brain and Mind Center and School of Psychology at University of Sydney. He is also affiliated with Harvard University Department of Psychology in the Schachter Memory Lab. And he comes from the University of Queensland School of Psychology, where he got his PhD in cognitive science. And much of his interests are surrounded around evolution, development, and some of the mechanisms for foresight, decision-making, imagination, emotion, and many other like topics. He is also one of the co-authors with Thomas Suddendorf and John Redshaw of the book, The Invention of Tomorrow, where they talk all about foresight. It's a fabulous book, and I was really thrilled to talk with Adam about the book. We kind of start by talking about how they wrote the book, which was really interesting. I mean, if you have three authors, it's like how does that work? How do people sit down and write it? And so he kind of talks a little bit about the behind the scenes, if you will, process of how they did it, which is super cool. And then we talk about foresight, what it is, how it's different from prospective memory. We talk about some of the executive functioning implicated in foresight. We talk about episodic foresight, abstraction, theory of mind. We talk about the evolutionary history of foresight and cultural evolution. We talk about foresight in human development, predictive models and perception and intelligence, the various brain systems involved with foresight, how foresight is implicated for new technology and social dynamics, how foresight, and a little bit more broadly, personality is measured. We talk about clock time and many other topics. Again, this was a really, really big delight. The book, The Invention of Tomorrow, was one of my favorites this year. It was, I think I say in the conversation, I read it in 2 sittings. Just a marvelous book. It's, folks that read a lot of these kinds of books on evolution or evolutionary time, things like that, they start to all kind of have a lot of overlap, which isn't a bad thing. But this really felt fresh and really, I think, important ways and help us to understand more about cognitive science in general. Again, as always, you can get this episode anywhere where you listen to podcasts, but also you can subscribe for my free Substack, convergingdialogues.substack.com. And now I bring you Adam Bulley. I am here with Adam Bulley. Adam, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've been very much looking forward to talking to you about the book that you've co-authored and hearing everything about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, of course. So you are forward in time, which was apropos for the topic of the book.
That's right.
So
down here in Sydney.
You're down under. So before we get into the book and everything about it, just tell listeners who you are, what you study, what your background is, and what you're up to more currently.
Yeah, so I'm a cognitive scientist. I study decision-making, imagination, memory, and foresight, which is the topic of the book, The Invention of Tomorrow, which we've just put out. And most of my work is basically all about how people make decisions about the future, especially when the outcomes play out over time. And in the book, we basically tackle the question of how this capacity to think about and imagine the future came about, how it works, how it operates in the brain, what its functions are, why it matters, and all of the different ways that it manifests in human life. And so, yeah, my academic work has revolved mostly around those kinds of questions, but I've tackled it from various different angles. So I wouldn't say I'm allied to one particular tool. Really, the question has been driving the research. And I've tackled it from various angles, including, for example, developmental psychology, behavioral economics, a bit of neuroscience, and just basically all of the different tools that are subsumed under the general category of cognitive science, which is a very sort of interdisciplinary field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's wonderful. When I saw the book and then I was hearing about it, it seemed like such a novel idea. Now, I'm not close to this type of research, but you don't hear a lot about research in foresight. So, and especially the evolution of it. So it seemed very novel, at least to me. And the book is fabulous. It's a great book. So, I guess just a kind of a preamble here of sorts. So this is 3 authors. So anytime this happens when there's a bunch of people, I'm like, what was that Google Doc looking like? What were those Zoom calls like? How did you write this chapter? Okay, steal this part from my paper. How did you guys, I guess, it's not a long book. It's a really nice, concise book. How did you guys just kind of the writing process and decide, who does what and, who gets their name first on there and all that good stuff, right? Yeah,
almost the mechanics of it. Yeah, it is interesting. It's a fascinating kind of process, as just from a kind of project management point of view, even. For context. So Thomas Zundorf, who's the lead author on the book, he has been studying mental time travel, which is this metaphor we use for the ability to travel backwards and forwards in time in your mind's eye. For decades, and he really was one of the first people to kind of put forward this argument that foresight is really a prime mover in human evolution and one of the things that sets us apart from other animals. Both Jonathan Redshaw and myself studied with Thomas. Like we both did our PhDs with him, and we worked with him for years and years, and we've continued to collaborate. And at a certain point, I think Thomas came up with the idea, said, maybe it's time we all sort of team up and kind of bring this to a wider audience. Yeah. And that's what we did. And as for the actual writing of the book, it was originally we were thinking, we had grand visions of ourselves tucked away in some, holiday home writing next to a beach or something. But then COVID happened. So much of the book was written over in Zoom calls, like extensive Zoom calls. We just sort of fit it around wherever we could. It was a lot of, basically one person would write a first draft of a piece of text, and then we would heavily edit it over time, where all 3 of us would basically, we'd dive in, we'd make changes, and then we'd resolve everything basically word by word over time, so that we got a shared voice. So that was really important to us, was that the book doesn't, you hopefully would not be able to tell, Adam wrote this chapter or something like that. Really, the idea was it's a consistent shared voice, and the narrative should flow through, without it feeling like the academic kind of text where you've got different invited chapters or something along those lines. Yeah.
Usually what I see when people co-author, or there's a few authors, they'll say, well, when and then they put the author in parentheses, and, sometimes you can kind of see styles of like, this feels a little different than the last chapter. And so that's actually helpful to know.
You didn't have your detective hat on while you were reading it?
No, it seemed very, I did think about this. I was like, okay, well, who wrote this section? And it did seem very seamless. So it's
okay. Well, good. So maybe we've hit the ball there.
Right. Yeah. The book is called The Invention of Tomorrow, A Natural History of Foresight. And it's again, as I said, it's wonderful. I mean, I probably read it in 2 sittings. It's really, really good. So you tackled this question of foresight. So maybe tell us what is foresight? And more specifically, how does evolution explain this ability in humans, and why it's been so consequential for us?
Yeah, maybe a good starting point, as you mentioned before, is you said you're not that aware of research on foresight. Partly that's because, for the vast majority of the emphasis in psychology, it's been on memory. And one way of thinking about foresight is that it's the future-directed component of our memory. So we use this metaphor in the book of a mental time machine, which comprises the ability to kind of traverse the span of time in your mind's eye, encapsulating both your ability to revisit the episodes and events from your life that have happened to you thus far, as well as imagine possible events that might happen in the future. And it's really been a very active and interesting fulcrum of research over the past few decades, determining how this works. And one of the key findings is that what you're really doing much of the time when you imagine the future is combining and recombining bits and pieces from memory to put them together in novel configurations that gives you, in order to get a sense of what might happen tomorrow and beyond.
So how does this, I guess, juxtapose, or maybe it isn't, or maybe it is, or it's just a different name of what we know as prospective memory? So when you learn the different types of memory, there's so much memory in our brain, working memory, long-term memory, short-term memory, remote, recent, etc. But in terms of prospective memory, this is what it sounds like. How is it? Is it synonymous, or is it different? How does it work there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So prospective memory, for those who don't know, is the memory for intentions that we have to perform. So, for example, if you need to remember to pick up bread on the way home from work today, or if you're in the car right now listening to this podcast and you have to, remember to pick up the milk. That's the kind of, it's the memory for intentions that we need to perform after a delay in time, or upon reaching some kind of salient cue. So you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to pick up bread when I get home, or I'm going to take my pill that I need to take once a day at 6 p.m. So that's prospective memory. That involves both a future directed component, which is that I have to make an intention to do something at a future point in time. And then I have to hold that intention somewhere in mind in order to be able to execute it when the appropriate cue occurs, whether that is the amount of time has passed or whether the cue has now become available in my environment. What we're talking about here is more it's closer to that first component, that intention aspect. It's the ability to actually actively envisage, think about and imagine future events. And in humans, this is really highly elaborated. And, one of the questions you asked a moment ago was why was this important in human evolution? And the major reason is just that it actually underpins, or it's critical for many of the really fundamentally powerful traits that human beings are very good at. So it's essential for things like anticipating dangers and preparing for those dangers. It enables us to create innovations in advance of when we need them, prepare tools so that when the time comes, we can tackle the challenges on the horizon. And it's useful to contrast that with how, I'm sure we'll get into this later, but how many other animals might use their future directed capacities, which they do have. There is plenty of future directed cognition happening in nature, but humans can envisage distant times and places that are totally remote from what you're experiencing in the present. You can let your mind wander not only to, next week's birthday party, but also to what you're going to do next year, how your retirement will play out, and even what might happen after your own death. And that uses the same basic neurocognitive machinery that we would use to revisit the past, but just, used in a slightly different way.
So how much of it sounds like the intentionality piece is a key aspect here, but is the foresight component predominantly or only for certain types of risk, or for some anticipatory type of thing? So like, let me make sure that I can get a house that has a good security system just in case someone might break into my, stuff like that. Is it always with a kind of pragmatic kind of way, or is that just one kind of lane for it, and we can use foresight in for types of fantasy, or some types of what are we going to be doing in 30 years, just generally? Like, is it always prescriptive or not?
Yeah, that's another very interesting question. I think it's not always pragmatic. No, I mean, if you think about if you've ever tried to meditate, and you sit down and you just pay attention to your breath or something, you just notice, if you pay attention, many of your thoughts will be about the future. If you actually then thought, how many of these do I really need to be thinking about? How many of them are really pragmatic? Well, I think that the proof's in the pudding. Much of the time, we are just idly fantasizing. We're thinking about what might happen, and not even only just to ourselves. What might happen to other people? What might happen in global affairs? How might these particular economic policies affect different people? Or how might sea levels change with global warming? Whatever it is, but this same ability that you can use in all these different ways, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about the fact that its open-endedness is really critical. It's hugely generative. You can also use that to very precisely make a plan of action to address an upcoming challenge. You can use it to prepare a tool in advance of when you need it. And in hominin evolution, one of the major arguments of the book is that this ability to anticipate what might happen and then make a concrete series of plans to address that upcoming challenge is extremely powerful, and is one of the things that, in combination with culture and some other fundamental aspects of human evolution, was a kind of prime mover in getting us to where we are now.
What about in terms of I know we're still on foresight, so just generally, so I'm as all these things are coming to me though, I'm curious about in terms of foresight with executive functioning abilities, so planning, sequencing, and organizing. So there's obviously things that we already do, right? But you need some executive functioning for planning for future things. So if I'm going to say to somebody, here's how you get to, the nearest gas station. You're going to go down the road, you're going to turn left at the light, then you're going to go down 2 kilometers, and then you're going to, there's a whole sequence of things. How much of, in terms, I guess, of the mechanics of the executive function is it? And then a separate question here is how much of creativity is involved in foresight? So if I think in the future about all these different ways I could do or not do things, and my imaginative or creative mind is kind of accessed, what that can do as well. I mean, those are 2 separate questions, but I'm curious of how foresight works for both of them.
Yeah, interesting. And they're 2 separate questions, but they actually cut to the heart of something quite important, which is that we don't really conceive of foresight as just, for example, one specific module in the brain that achieves a particular goal. Instead, foresight is actually the result of an interacting suite of cognitive capacities that all work together, doing lots of different jobs to enable us this mental access to the future. You mentioned 2 of them. So executive functions, absolutely critical, not only for example, inhibiting temptations that you might face along the way to achieve some kind of goal, but also for the complex structuring of a plan. As you mentioned, if you want to create a series of steps to achieve some goal, you need some executive function to be able to organize the information in a way that can lead you there. Creativity, again, very fundamental. If you define creativity as something like the ability to generate novelty, identify the useful bits and pieces of that novelty, and then put that towards achieving something, foresight is very creative because, in essence, what you're doing is, as I mentioned earlier, combining bits and pieces from memory, things you've experienced in the past, and then putting them together in novel constellations that enable you to anticipate what might happen. And it's creative in the sense also that one of the key things about human foresight is that we can anticipate mutually exclusive alternative versions of the same event. We know that the future is not just, it's not just a one-track trolley going in a single direction. Instead, it splits, it branches. And so there's a creativity involved in making up, essentially conjuring up multiple mutually exclusive alternatives. This might happen, or this might happen, or this might happen. And you can see how that could be both useful and kind of unpleasant
and neurotic as well.
Yes, exactly right.
Right. Okay, great. So I guess you mentioned earlier in the book about how foresight is important for distinguishing between recklessness and negligence. So maybe just talk about how it can be important for distinguishing between those 2 things.
Yeah, in the book we mentioned that basically as a way to kind of set the stage to lay out just how critical foresight is to so much of human affairs that you might otherwise usually not, usually just take it for granted. It's such a fundamental process. It's so important that we often just, we take it for granted. And that's just an example from the legal domain, So in law, it's absolutely, commonly the case that if you're being negligent, you're failing to anticipate a danger that you should have foreseen. If you're being reckless, then you've foreseen the danger and you've acted anyway, and some negative harm has occurred. But you see that the foresight is absolutely baked in to so many of our institutions. I'll give you some other examples of ways that it crops up and why it's important to understand it. It's essential for example, our sense of free will, our sense that we have authorship over our actions. We're steering the ship. It's also essential for arguments about moral consequentialism, anticipating what might happen and arguing endlessly over what the right way to proceed is. And I mentioned a minute ago, it's also absolutely fundamental for giving us our anxieties. If you didn't have foresight, you might not have to worry all that much about what might happen. in the future. And so these are all just examples of situations where like foresight is really critical to human affairs, both for individual people and also like for our societies. But it's often kind of overlooked or taken for granted. And so that's the kind of the point of the book is, okay, well, given that this thing crops up everywhere and is so fundamental, where did it come from? And, how does it work?
I think you mentioned it already, but you talked about this episodic foresight, right? So you mentioned this kind of virtual time machine in our mind. And so I'm curious about how do we understand that for ourselves as individuals, but then also are we able to look at that for other people as well? So if I look at people in my family, and I can imagine where they could be or where they might be in the future. Like there's another level of abstraction there as well. It's not just for ourselves, but we can do it for others or groups or things like that. So maybe just chat more about the virtual time machine and then the idea for ourselves and for others and how it expands.
Yeah, great. So the reason we would call it episodic foresight is that it refers to the episodes of our lives that we can imagine in the future. And the reason for that term is ultimately that it's the future-directed component of the well-established component of memory, which is episodic memory. So episodic memory is the memory for the episodes of our life, and it's often put in contrast to something like semantic memory, which is our memory for specific facts. So, like the capital of France is Paris or whatever.
As opposed to procedural memory, which is, how we are able to do things and all these types of sorts of
exactly things. Right. Yeah, exactly. So you can fractionate and split up memory into multiple different components. The same can be said of foresight. And episodic foresight, it's mainly what we take aim at in the book, is the ability to imagine specific episodes in the future, things that could happen to you. As for the question about, whether we use it to imagine what other people will be doing in the future in the minds of this cuts to the heart of the fact that this is a very nested thought process. Like it involves a lot of metacognition. So, for example, I can imagine not only my own mind in the future, but I can also imagine what you might think in the future and how you might act. And so that's theory of mind, right? I can appreciate what's going on inside your head, but I can also put that forward in time. Obviously, that is absolutely essential for any kind of negotiation, for any kind of conflict between two people or groups of people. And it can get very, very nested where I can anticipate that if I make such and such an action, then you will think that I think that, and you just carry on. So you get this kind of very nested, very complicated, recursive type of cognition where foresight is being used to project forward in time, but then along for the ride comes, theory of mind, mentalizing, empathy, and all the rest.
Well, you could probably go a couple layers deeper, no? You could also do this where...
I'll lose track.
well, no, in terms of further the abstraction. So like, I can think about what... Raskolnikov is thinking about potentially in the future in Crime and Punishment as a character, which it doesn't exist. It's not a real character. It's not a real person. And I can think about what other characters in the book think about and what they're, there's these levels of abstraction that we have that are obviously for ourselves and then for other people, people that have been in the past, people that may exist in the future, but then also fictitious characters. The way in which we're able to abstract this way is pretty layered, no?
It's very layered. It's really remarkable, especially when you put it like that. It reminds me, study this thing a lot and you read about it and stuff. And then you hear something like that, you go, wow, it is actually just quite amazing that the brain is able to achieve that. It really is. That's it actually draws on the point that really when you're imagining the future of any kind, it's fictitious. That's kind of an important insight. It's like when you're imagining the future, what you're really doing is pulling something out of the ether. It's a fictional scenario that your brain is cooking up. Right. And one of the problems is that people face is I think they imagine what's going to happen to them in the future, and then they reify that, they make it real. They treat that very differently from how they would treat any other imagining in their mind's eye, because we feel like we have a ability to predict and we understand what's going to happen. Ultimately, though, there's a kind of humility that's important there, which is to recognize that what you're cooking up is just a mental production. It's like a stage show. We use this metaphor in the book of you putting on a play, and then that play gets attributed with this futurity. So, okay, this is about the future. This is what is going to happen. And then you can also appraise it. This is where metacognition becomes critical again. You can ask yourself, maybe this is just wishful thinking, or maybe this time it really will occur. So having that confidence finely tuned about our predictions is also absolutely critical. It's a skill that you can kind of, I think it's important to learn.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do want to come back to the stage analogy, but before that, you mentioned here cultural evolution. So we've been talking a little bit about foresight generally, but much of the book, that's in the book, but obviously you talk about the book from an evolutionary perspective. And so I guess one question I have is how do we, obviously this is something that we can't know, like when did this start for Homo sapiens, or maybe even for other types of humans, but where do we kind of see some of these ideas start to develop as far as like foresight to do this? So I'm assuming the idea of fire and tools, and I know you talk about that later in the book, but maybe just kind of give us a kind of overview of how we understand foresight, kind of the evolutionary history. But really, I also want to know, and maybe this is wrapped up in the question, but about how important cultural evolution is as well, because I can imagine that, culture has a big part to play here. In looking at groups of people and how they're cooperative or not, et cetera.
Yeah, it's actually really useful that you kind of have that double barrel question there, which includes both the evolutionary story and the cultural evolutionary part of the picture, because they are deeply intertwined. What might be helpful is maybe just to kind of talk through some of the key stages at a kind of bird's eye view about how we think this ability might have evolved. And obviously it has a very, very long, deep history, ecological, biological history. But maybe it's a useful starting point is to take the split that led to both modern chimpanzees and modern humans. 6-7 million years ago. You say, okay, since that time, the chimpanzees have been evolving. We've been evolving as well. What has happened in that time? And some of the sort of early, and all of this, as you mentioned, very important caveat. A lot of it is very tentative. Obviously, I'm not an archaeologist, but we've attempted to digest and understand the implications of the archaeology for understanding the cognitive evolution here. If you go back, one of the first stages was probably the move onto the savannah, and having all these threats in the environment which were not there prior to that. New threats are a source of selection pressure. And that selection pressure may have been, favored the individuals who prepared. Well, you ask, well, what is the preparation that you can do? Well, one of the things you can do is you can pick up a rock and you can throw it at something that's attacking you. Collaboratively, multiple people all picking up rocks and throwing them at a predator is much more effective. So you have that collaborative element, which is essential if you're going to use this kind of defensive strategy. Now, it's all well and good to pick up a rock when a predator's coming at you, right? But I think it's much more useful if you already have one. And so you can see the selective pressure on being prepared by actually carrying objects to throw in the initial stages. And that's a pretty intuitive picture. Again, there's a lot of good, for example, like data showing that hand anatomy is like adapted in early hominins for throwing and clubbing. But we just simply don't know exactly when they picked things up to throw in defensive ways. And we also don't know when they would have started picking things up to carry them for use in the future. But it's a plausible account about how some of the early signs of the recognition that I will need an object that I do not currently possess in order to tackle a challenge that will happen to me in the future. Now, you move forward a bit in time, eventually you do see signs, so there's 3.3 million year old rocks from Lamekwi where you can see that, well, these hominins have started to make tools. And so they actually, these are made very similar to how chimpanzees will use a rock to smash a nut open and get the food inside. Use a similar kind of technique to smash open, to smash a rock, and then use the edge of the rock to perform jobs, cutting and stuff, digging. Later still, by about 2.5 million years ago, the tools get slightly more sophisticated, older one tools associated with Homo habilis. And these tools are more sophisticated still. But what we don't see even at that stage is really compelling evidence that they were created in one place, carried somewhere else for use in the future. And that's really important, because that shows, clearly that the tools were not just built and then used when they were needed. Instead, there was some anticipation of what might happen in the future that was driving the behavior. By the time of around 1.7 million years ago, you have Acheulean hand axes, very symmetrical in shape. Not only does the tool itself require foresight to build, because you need to have a plan of how you're going to achieve an objective. There's a kind of in the mind's eye, it needs to be anticipated, but also the tools were carried around and used repeatedly. So now they're not just made and then discarded. Throughout this whole process, there's a kind of foresight culture feedback loop taking place where, for example, if I use my individual foresight to innovate in some way to build a slightly better hand axe, I can pass that on and teach that new ability to other people. So I've innovated because I've recognized that the slight change I've made to the manufacture is better, and I'm now going to teach that to other people. And so both the innovation itself requires some foresight because I'm attempting to achieve a goal, and the transmission requires some foresight because it's the sharing of the information. We don't really see that taking off until later, and there are better, more recent examples that we can go through in a minute if you're interested. But what we do see, what we argue in the book, is essentially that there's this kind of feedback loop between the cultural transmission of information and the individual people anticipating and thinking about the future that drives the technological progression forwards. And so that takes us to about Homo erectus about 1.8 million years ago. And we can keep going, but maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah, I guess I'm already sort of maybe jumping ahead here, where it's like how you're describing this in terms of making tools and things like that, and how foresight works, sounds not too dissimilar to how we see other animals. I'm thinking of corvids. You mentioned chimpanzees. They also use tools. I think elephants use tools as well, or a type of tool or something like that as well. Yeah. And so is it just, where was the switch from how human foresight, where it's very human? What you've described feels very mammalian of sorts, or maybe high mammalian, if you will. But where was it where it was like, boom, okay, that's where it's human, distinct from all these other types of animals? Was it the idea or the concept of language that when that comes on the scene, or where do we get to start seeing the very human specific pieces? Yeah, no, that's great. I think ultimately, kind of important caveat is that there is really no specific moment where you could point at it and you could say, okay, now. Yes. And the reason for that is it's not so much about the evolution of the ability per se, but it's also just the diversity of abilities that you see in the animal kingdom. You mentioned a few already. And all animals have things that make them unique. And we say, human uniqueness is no different from that, really. Like we have our own special abilities. The tool use of other animals is very interesting. It's like amazing capacity, as you mentioned already. Jane Goodall found chimpanzees using tools, using stones. You see tool use in corvids. When they, and so just to give people an example if they don't know. So for example, a chimpanzee will even sometimes pick up a tool, carry it for, a few hundred yards, and then use the tool to crack open a nut, which implies that the chimpanzee can keep the goal in its mind's eye while it achieves, picks up a tool in order to achieve that goal later. So there is that. Generally speaking, animals will use a tool and then they'll discard it. So they won't keep it, modify it, and hold on to it for future use. So there is really no opportunity for the kind of cultural evolutionary ratcheting up of the sophistication of the tools, partly just simply because they're just not held on to. Because, one of the ideas here is that they do not have the sophisticated foresight required to recognize that if you keep hold of it, you could use it again, especially if you've put any effort into using it. But it's a feedback loop here. And one of the key insights that makes this even possible in the hominin lineage is probably something as simple as the invention of bags.
like mobile carrying containers.
Hmm.
If you only have two hands, you can't really just keep hold of your tools. If you're a chimpanzee, the same applies, because you need your hands to do other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just a simple pragmatic thing that where you invent a bag, you now have carrying capacity that's extended beyond just the two hands that you have available to carry immediate objects. Now you have the motivation to actually sit down and prepare objects and items in advance of when they'll actually be needed, because you can keep them on your person. You have a sort of portable life support system. You have a tool kit. You don't just have a single tool.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's just an example of a kind of key innovation that once you have it, it in turn puts more selective pressure on what you might call the uniquely human elements of foresight. For instance, that I can anticipate multiple mutually exclusive futures. And so therefore, I'm going to pack my bag with multiple different tools that I might need to tackle different things that could happen, various threats and opportunities that lie ahead.
Yeah, it's like if you go on a trip, right? And you say, oh, well, let me look at the weather to see what the weather is. And then I can know what kinds of outfits I'm going to pack, right? So if it's like, well, hot in the day and cool at night, well, I might need to bring a sweater or, a jacket or a throw over or something, but I'm going to make sure I bring, these types of clothes. Like that's all you're imagining. You could be in another place. If I'm traveling tomorrow to Indonesia, I'm probably not going to bring a jacket, right? Or maybe if it's raining or whatever, but you get the idea, right? Is that, I have some idea of what this will be like, what the weather will be like, probably be very humid. Okay, I need to pack this kind of clothing, and bug spray and all of these things to help me out. There's a certain kind of foresight that goes into that, because you're imagining a situation and certain tools or certain things that you need for the occasion.
Yeah, and actually, what you just got out there, the specific ability to imagine that while you're not cold right now, you might be if you go to a cold place. That ability specifically, and this gets us slightly into the details here about what might separate human foresight from the foresight of other animals. If you think about what that entails, what it involves is anticipating a drive or a need state that you do not currently possess.
Yeah.
And so there's this hypothesis called the Bischoff-Curler hypothesis, which is that other animals, as future oriented as their cognition can be, they lack that specific ability to envisage or anticipate a drive state that they don't currently possess. So if they're not hungry now, they will not start seeking out the process to achieve food that they will need later, because they can't appreciate that while they're not currently hungry, they will be later. And this has been the sort of center on the bullseye for attempts to find evidence of non-human foresight, because it offers up a fairly neat empirical opportunity here. You can say, well, if I could demonstrate, for example, that my crow or my chimpanzee does something in the present to achieve the fulfillment of a drive that the animal doesn't currently have, well, then you falsified the Bischoff-Curler hypothesis, which was one of the key things that might set human foresight apart from the foresight of other animals.
Yeah, that's super, super interesting. Okay, so let's talk about development. There's I think a chapter or two, maybe it's in two chapters, which was really interesting. It's a really interesting part of the book where you talk about the developmental aspects of foresight, in early childhood, and how children learn to have combinational capacities, executive control, temporality of sorts. And so the question I have here is, how do we understand how foresight develops in childhood and throughout various life stages? And you give age 4 as a really important point for some of these skills. So maybe you can bring back the analogy of the stage here, because I think that's what you use the stage for explaining the developmental aspects of foresight.
Yeah, exactly. So we use the stage to illustrate the fact that this is multiple interacting components that in tandem give you access to the future. And all of these different components, for example, working memory, executive function, language, these different components come online at different times. So you can think of it as a very gradual process in the course of development. If you look at a human baby, newborn, it's one of the most helpless creatures that exist on this planet. And yet somehow, by the time they're fully grown adults, they can imagine, the long-term future of our species and, the end of the universe and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so how does that happen? Expansion of the time horizon across early childhood and beyond. So the reason we give age 4 as a critical point is because at age 4, you start to see some very important transitions in behavioral abilities, which show us that the child is starting to get a grasp on the future. Of course, you can just ask a child, like a 3 or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, what they, can they imagine themselves in the future, and just talk to them about tomorrow. But they don't really, they'll sometimes say stuff that they clearly do not really use the words in the same way that we use the words. Sure. And so what scientists have done instead, developmental psychologists have done instead, is really tackle the behaviors. Okay, let's look at what the child does, and use many of the same techniques in comparative psychology with animals, because they can't speak either. And you then identify what the behavior tells you about the underlying cognitive capacities. So, for example, at age 4, children begin passing false belief tasks, where they can, reliably identify that another person believes something that the child themselves knows to be false. Or they start to pass simple tasks of foresight. I'll give you an example of one. So you take the child into one room, and you have a selection of objects. And in another room is a solution, is a box, a puzzle box, to which one of the items from the other room is a solution. Now, the question is, if you take the child into the room with the puzzle box, then into the room with the tools, and then you say, we're going to be going back into the other room, do they recognize that very simple ability to recognize the solution in one room, remember the original puzzle box, and then bring it back with them to use it to tackle the problem? And from around 4 years old, they start passing that. Another kind of empirical task, even simpler, stripped back behavioral capacity. My colleagues, Jonathan Redshaw and Thomas Sudendorf, have designed this fantastic, elegant paradigm where they have imagine a forked tube. So you've got a tube that goes straight down, like an upside down Y, and it has 2 exits at the bottom. Mm-hmm. So if you imagine that in your mind's eyes, you've got this straight down tube, and then it splits at the bottom, and there's 2 exits. Well, if you drop a prize, in this case a ball, into the top of the tube, it will fall down the tube and it will come out one of the 2 exits, right? Right. Now, when you give this, you say to children 3 years old, I want you to catch the ball. Well, what they tend to do is they'll put out one hand, and they'll go back and forth between the 2 exits. Right. From age 4, though, they seem to recognize that the single event of the ball dropping into the tube could have 2 mutually exclusive possible outcomes, and they put 2 hands out. They cover both exits to the tube reliably from the first trial, which seems to suggest that they recognize that not only the future branches into 2 possibilities, but also that their own predictions can be wrong, because they are not just putting out a single hand. If you just put out a single hand, that's making a prediction. What it's not doing is realizing that, it might not come out that side. And the only way to guarantee it is to do a very simple form of contingency planning, which is to put the other hand out to cover the other exit. And at age 4, children will achieve that reliably.
It's interesting because, it sounds like some of the, what is it? It's the pre-operational thought that Piaget talked about, right? Where children are learning how to understand various aspects. It seems like this experiment and maybe others are just really, really more specific in looking at other aspects of cognition in development to say, well, what else is going on here, right? How do we understand how young people are understanding themselves, their future, potential futures? How do they understand that those things are going on? So again, about the stage. So where does the stage analogy fit in here in terms of development? in terms of
so the stage specifically, so we say because the mental production taking place, and in order to achieve that, you have all these different interacting components, and we basically say it's like a stage, like a theater production. So the stage is like your working memory, where you need to put aside whatever's happening in the environment around you in order to put on this production. So you need some ability to suspend your immediate surroundings and you imagine something. You also need to populate that stage, not only with features of the world, but so you need some sense of folk physics and intuitive understanding of how things interact and move, but with actors as well. And so you need a theory of mind to be able to anticipate what other people would do in your mental theater scenario that you've just built up, the play that you're staging in your mind's eye. You also need a director to be able to say, okay, this doesn't really work. Let's try something else, to basically evaluate or appraise the things that you're imagining. And you need an executive producer to stop thinking and actually put thought into action, do something about it. And all of these abilities, as you just mentioned before, you kind of studying all these different aspects of cognition, you basically study all of them individually. And you build up a picture of how foresight emerges in childhood. So for example, something like the executive producer to be able to say, okay, we've done enough thinking, we now need to put thought into action, or the executive control to say, actually, we're going to put that on the back burner. We're going to stop doing this and we're going to do something else instead. Is very much related to this ability to inhibit your impulses. And so, many people will have heard of the marshmallow test, for example, where children are given, one marshmallow now, and if they can wait for the second marshmallow, and they can have two. Now, that ability involves both choosing to delay gratification and then maintaining that choice against the immediate temptation, which is on offer. And so it's a kind of executive control process. It's just an example of how this kind of thing fractionates out into various different subcomponents.
Yeah. So what is the role of perception here with foresight? You mentioned this in the book about how we perceive things. I guess this kind of goes back to the question we said earlier about how we're just making fictitious accounts in our mind, right, of sorts, but does the perception question become a reality question? And if so, is it important or not? Where does perception fit in here?
I suppose one way of thinking about what you're doing when you're imagining anything is rerunning the perceptual configuration that took place when you saw something for the first time. And so there's been argument.
So like the novelty of it, right?
Yeah. Well, what I'm getting at is that you can think of imagination as a kind of top-down form of perception. Yeah. Where what you're essentially doing is like replaying the neural pattern that occurred when you actually perceived and encoded some information in the first place. And so, for example, like let's just use a really stripped back example. If I ask you to imagine an apple in your mind's eye, and this ability varies between people. Some people can pull up a very vivid apple. I mean, where do you stand? Can you bring an apple into the mind's eye?
Yeah, I usually think of two things almost at the same time. So I think of a red Fuji apple because those are my favorite. And then
that's a specific type of apple.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I like Gala apples. I like Honeycrisp apples, but Fuji apples are probably my favorite. And then I almost immediately at the same time I just think of like, I don't want to say the archetype of a red apple, but I think of like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and the witch has like the red apple, and it's like very like overly red and shiny, and
it's like the platonic ideal of an apple.
Right. Yeah, so okay. I kind of like think about like the last time I was in the grocery store and I bought Fuji apples, and like, oh yeah, this will be a good snack when I'm eating later. I'm remembering the time that I thought about when I would be hungry in the future, that whole thing, right? And then I also think about like the fictitious account of Snow White, and the red apple. So I literally almost at the same time think about.
All right, so you're a discerning apple connoisseur. and you've brought this apple into your mind's eye. Well, one way of thinking about what's going on there is that the brain is essentially triggering the neural pattern that was associated with the actual perception of an apple, but it's also the abstraction that you just mentioned. It's the generalization out from the specific exemplar. So generally, when people are imagining an apple, they are not remembering one specific apple that they encountered, although you can do that too. You can also bring to mind the abstracted exemplar of an apple. And that capacity for abstraction and, in turn, symbolic thought is actually also very important for imagining the future. The perception question, though, that you started with, just in general, it's true both that perception is involved in foresight, but there's also a predictive element to perception. So I don't know if you've talked about this with guests on the podcast before, but the centrality of predictive processing to any kind of perceptual experience. Have you got into that here?
I don't think so. Maybe not directly, which I have to think about all my conversations. But yeah. I may have touched on it, but it's not ringing a bell. So go ahead. Go with it.
Yeah. So basically, you might say, all right, well, even very simple acts of perception require some pretty sophisticated predictive processing. For example, if you wanted to try and catch a ball that was being thrown in your direction, it's not enough to wait until the object has reached you. You have to predict its trajectory ahead of time. Your brain has to predict its trajectory in order to move the hand to receive the ball where it's going to end up rather than where it is right now.
So that's happening, but terribly unconsciously, usually.
Yes,
People
exactly. So this is different.
Measuring it out. Like, it's usually like, I have to kind of sort of do this, but most people kind of anticipate. But yes, there's all these other things unbeknownst to us at the moment that our brain is doing. Yeah. Yeah.
And the timescales here are like way condensed. So this is not, this is not the focus. This is not the kind of foresight that we talk about necessarily in the book. But what it does serve to show is that there's a continuum of predictive processing in the brain. So at the very, very, very narrow level, your brain is making predictions about what it expects to see next. And then it's comparing what it actually sees, what evidence actually comes streaming in through the senses. It's comparing that with what it predicted in order to fine tune its next predictions, which is a very efficient way of processing information about the world as you move about in it.
So how is this different, I guess, or is it a type of, I don't mean it in a very strict sense of the word, but sometimes people will say this is what it means to be intelligent, right? That the brain is a predicting mechanism. Like, it's predicting, it's envisioning something, and then it's using these kind of models with Bayesian priors to then make predictions of things. And then we confirm or deny those things. Some people associate that with kind of intelligence, or whatever.
Yeah.
I guess, how do you don't have to get down that rabbit hole if you don't want to, but where do we pull out this perceptual piece and maybe a type of intelligent, quote unquote, piece?
Well, I actually think that's an unresolved question. It's a very deep issue. It's a very deep question. It's like, so the brain has got predictive processing happening at very many time scales. So it's got the very short time scales that I just mentioned, milliseconds of prediction, where I'm anticipating what the next orientation of a line is going to be, or something like that in the visual system, all the way through to the prediction involved in catching a ball, the prediction involved in anticipating what might happen as you're driving, anticipating whether someone's going to come at you from a different angle, to the prediction involved in what you're going to do for dinner tonight, to tomorrow's breakfast, to next year's birthday party, to your retirement. Exactly how the prediction, in inverted commas, the prediction involved in all of those different abilities is related, is unknown. Like, I don't think there is no overarching theory of exactly how those different types of prediction are all precisely instantiated in the brain and how they connect to one another. And it's actually an active area of theoretical and empirical research.
Okay, so my question on that is that wouldn't the underlying principle there be that the common denominator there is, it's all prediction, It's just prediction in different domains, different categories, and different time scales, which is fine. That can be, that can have difference, but it doesn't matter in one sense if I'm predicting how to anticipate a ball getting thrown at my face, or the car moving into the next lane, or what I'm doing for my retirement party whenever that happens. The common theme is that there's prediction happening, right?
Yeah. And but exactly. So you've got a common theme that there's prediction happening. But then the question is, well, how is that prediction instantiated in the brain and in cognitive systems? Is it the same kind? Where does it become the same kind of prediction? Where is it not? So, for example, what exactly is there mechanistically in common between predicting the car in the next lane swerving in front of you and predicting what you're going to do, with your retirement savings?
Well, the obvious thing is the temporality of it. That it's more likely, because there's some familiarity of it, that we drive. Most people drive, so if you're driving on a road, you've had that happen over and over and over and over and over and over and over. You're going to retire once probably, and that's so far in the future. For example, let me ask a related question. One time I did this exercise with myself. I'll do these thought exercises, and I'll think to myself, can I think about the future of, let's just say, the planet for a minute, or the current state of the world or whatever, 5 years from now? Sure. 2015 isn't that different from 2020 on a lot of things, right? Can I do 10 years? Yep. You could probably say the same thing. 2010 from 2020, there's difference, but it's not tremendously different. But there's a limit we have in time. So like there's contours to this. I literally cannot imagine. I cannot imagine 100 years from now. I have no fucking idea what that looks like. I have no concept. Will we? Because like look, think about somebody that was doing this exercise in 1902, and you were to say, can you think about what 2002 looks like? I mean, they would lose their mind. They would literally lose their mind. There's no way. Yeah. We didn't have planes. We barely had cars. No radio, no TV, no internet, no cell phones, fax machines, all those things. Yeah. Like, it's just, okay, fine. And look, the way we progress in life is faster and faster and faster and faster. So like, does, 1400 look wildly different from 1600? No. Does 1600 from 1800 look wildly different? There's more difference generally, but it's not dramatic. 1900 to 2000, big jumps. 1950 to 2000, big jumps. Okay, we get it. And even if you do go back 10 years, 2010 to 2023, essentially, there is a lot of things happening fast, and there is a lot of changes. I mean, the iPhone had only been out for 3 years. Amazon hadn't really been out. Streaming services. There are changes, but there are some functionality. So, like, when I think about foresight, generally, and then for myself, so I won't be on the planet in 100 years, which is weird to like. I know that
you might get lucky,
but then I think about it. I'm like, wow, that's weird. And then you can start to think about like, well, knowing the age I am now, it's unlikely I'll be on the planet. I mean, maybe in 50 years, which is also very terrifying existentially. But then it's like, okay, fine, whatever. But like when you look at the future, you're like, I can't think about for myself or just for the planet what 100 years looks like. I can barely do 50.
Yeah.
I can maybe do 20, 25. Really, like actually like predicting.
So what's interesting there is that you're doing it kind of that you've got a sort of humility about your prediction of the future there, because you can. Well, I'm not I'm not trying to just give you a compliment there. What I mean is you are imagining the future. Like you could, I think you could. You could. Well,
I can't.
You're self-aware enough to know that whatever you conjure up in your mind's eye is just almost certainly wrong. Is that what you mean, or do you mean you draw a blank?
Well, kind of both. So 100 years, I'm kind of blank. Like, will we still have cities, and will we still do stuff, and will we still eat, and have certain types of entertainment, and want to be together with other humans? Yeah, sure, fine. Like the basic things we've been doing for thousands of years, fine. But like, actually, like on a day-to-day basis, I have no idea. Like in 1950, people thought like, what was the Jetsons, right? People were gonna have flying cars in 2010. Like we are nowhere near that. I mean, there are some people that are pretty prescient. I mean, if you go back and watch 2001, you're like, wow, you kind of got it right. Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick, like there's a lot of things that they did. Holy shit. Like maybe they just, their magic 8 ball is pretty good or whatever. But like, yeah, I mean, for me personally, I can't. So it's like one of those things when people think about like even retirement.
Yeah.
No concept. I have no concept of what that looks like.
It's really difficult. Absolutely. I mean, it's what I think what you're getting at as well is just is simply the time horizon. That uncertainty. Like if you go further, as you move further and further away from the present, the uncertainty compounds, and you just get more and more profoundly unsure, grayer and grayer,
right,
and obscured into the fog of the future, and so on.
Correct.
I mean, there's a lot of things to say about that. One of them is if you're trying to make a decision about the future, well, then that's maybe one of the fundamental reasons that people discount outcomes that are delayed in time. So, as you move further away in time, the outcome, whether it's something good or bad, we just care less and less about it. And that could, in some sense, that could just derive from a fundamental limit in the ability to appreciate what the future will be like, especially as you start to get into those, deeper and deeper time horizons.
But doesn't it also have to depend on age and brain capacity? So like the decisions that I made at 19 or 20 are vastly different from the decisions I make now.
Yeah, let's not go there.
Partly because I've lived in the world. I've had experiences. I've suffered enough or whatever, and my brain is fully developed, and I'm a little bit more humble, I hope, and more mature. I've slowed down. I'm less sure of myself. All these things that were not true when I was 19. I was like, oh, I know everything I'm going to do, and this is totally the right thing, and absolutely, and whatever.
Yeah.
So then, when you make big life decisions, it's almost like there's like sometimes, in my field, in the clinical work I do, there's a difference when I talk to young people and they say like, oh, I'm going to marry this person, or I'm just going to get this job. I'm going to go to this school. Maybe I'll buy a house. Maybe I'll do these things. And you know what? Fuck it. We'll just figure it out. Right. And there's a kind of like this almost
like a bravado or an optimism or like a surety.
An optimism is maybe a nice way to say it. It's not a recklessness, although certainly young people can be reckless. I'm not saying that, but there's it's just like an optimism. It's like I don't want to use the whole like the world is your oyster kind of thing, but like there's a whole.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
It's like why not? Like let's just experience. Let's just see the world. Let's be on our own. Let's all these things, which is in standard development that's kind of normal. But like when I talk to older people, and I'm not saying older, like after 30 or even like 20s, but after 30, holy shit, like people can't decide who they want to be with. Oh no, but this and this, oh my goodness, and they're terrible, but I like this, and they can't decide if they want to rent a house with people, they want to buy their own house. Which one do I buy? Where do I buy it? Like when you're younger, it's like, well, fuck it, let's just get one and we'll figure it out later. Like when you're older, you've had these things. Same thing with career. Do I change a career? Do I do a different job? Do I do all these things? And I just feel like that continues maybe to like late 40s, early 50s. And then there's that kind of almost apathetic, like, well, fuck it. I got 30 years left maybe to live. Let's just, whatever. I've lived enough, whatever, let's just go with it.
Interesting. I mean, on one level, I mean, this is just speculating a bit here, but when you're very young, you have the ability to anticipate all these different possible futures for yourself. You can see yourself doing all these different jobs and being with all these different possible people and finding out all these new things. over time, you actually experience that like your plans can be thwarted.
Yes.
Like you start to learn, you learn that the future is actually, it's actually not yours to write in a purely fundamental way. Like there are, yes. You can have goals, you can have plans, and then they will go wrong. Things will get in the way. And so like over time, you maybe learn to kind of readjust your predictions. You make them slightly more realistic maybe. And then that kind of comes across as the neurosis and as the worry and as the anxiety, because there's a greater understanding of the fact that like this is not going to necessarily play out the way I want it to. Mm-hmm. And I think this is interesting. It's really a double-edged sword. Like we mentioned this many times in the book as well, that the foresight is not just this blessing. It's an incredibly powerful tool. But it's also a source of extreme misery.
Yes.
It's something that probably evolved to help us tackle upcoming challenges. And a very efficient way to prepare yourself for upcoming challenges is to just imagine a lot of them and all the different things that could go wrong and all the ways you might have to prepare for them. And so anxiety, I think, is really, it's a function largely of our extremely sophisticated and developed foresight.
Yeah, I mean, just as a kind of a concrete example of that, of how it can be a kind of, it's a great tool, it's powerful, but it can also be, it can give some angst of sorts. One of the things that when I was younger, much of my dad's parenting, both my parents, but my dad in particular sticks out in the moment, is he would always tell me all of the things that could go wrong. Right? So when I'm learning how to drive a car, or when I'm learning how to do an application, or when I'm, doing any of these things, like, okay, you need to think about all the ways it goes wrong. Right? It's just kind of a risk analysis. Did you complete it this way? Because if it doesn't happen this way, it doesn't, when I got the when I got the birds and the bees talk, it was all the ways things can go wrong. This can happen, this can happen, this can happen, this can happen. Do you want that will totally alter your life? Do you want to, are you sure? Oh, yikes. Maybe I don't want to do any of this ever. Right. So, and it's interesting because it's like, all of that's the foresight, right? Look at how your life could be. Look at all these things and all these situations, or just, whatever. And in a similar way, that's how I am with my daughter, and I will say, like, anytime she'll ask me something or we'll do something, I'll say, okay, but you need to think about all of the ways this can go
consequences.
Wrong. This is all the risk. Think about this, and this. Because, at a very fundamental level, that's what life is, right? It's trying to have, we want to survive, and we don't want to have these things that are high risk that could really harm us in a variety of ways. And, as a parent, there's some responsibility there of like making sure your kids are okay in the world. But it's interesting how like foresight, you're saying, can be a powerful tool, but it can also give you much consternation about all these potential things as well. No?
Yeah. And I think it's difficult actually to communicate all the things that could go wrong to a child, and for them to really understand, it.
Certainly.
And yes. So Thomas and John, the co-authors on this, on the book, they've been doing some studies actually recently on young children's ability to appreciate what could possibly go wrong in the world around them. And what you find is that they're just terrible at this. Like even once they've got the basics of the mental time machine online, when you put them in situations like, for example, you put a bunch of marbles on the floor in front of a door, or you put a vase right next to a basketball hoop, or you put, a little girl in eating spaghetti bolognese in a white dress or whatever. They just don't seem to appreciate, or, as an adult would really immediately just recognize, okay, move the vase, clean up the marbles and put put an apron on or whatever. But just kids just find it really, really difficult to appreciate the different possible ways that things could go wrong. And obviously that's really important when it comes to hazard perception, as you mentioned a moment ago, like when driving. Obviously this becomes much more sophisticated in adolescence and beyond. Right. But for younger children, simply telling them what could go wrong. It's not the same as them conjuring it up themselves and appreciating it as part of their own experience of the world. And so transmitting that is that those lessons, there's a kind of tension there. It's very difficult.
Yeah, I think some of that makes sense and is good. I mean, I think a lot of it is, well, that's why I have parents, right? You guys will take care of it, right? You guys you'll figure it out for me. I don't need to think about that. I'll think about that when I'm older.
Exactly.
And there's some, that kind of like quote unquote innocence that I think is good. We need that because, right? What is that when people say like, enjoy being the age you are? Because, when you're young, everyone wants to be 18, and then you get to 18, you're like, oh God, I can't take it back. Like I'm always going to be responsible. No one else is responsible for me anymore. There's elements of that where it's like, well, maybe some of it's a comprehension thing, but I think some of it is maybe just like a attachment thing of like, well, my parents take care of me. I feel safe and secure. They take care of me. Okay. I don't have to worry about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that Bischoff-Curler hypothesis thing I mentioned earlier, where the idea that the animals can't appreciate a drive state that they don't currently have. Well, children also, young children, before they really get the mental time machine, the gears start really running, they also really struggle with that. And so, for example, it's the parents who have to prepare lunch because the child's not hungry now, so they're not going to ask for it.
Right.
If the child's just had breakfast, they're not thinking about the fact that they're going to be hungry in the future. They don't prepare that kind of thing in advance. Another simple example, like you mentioned earlier, taking clothes. If you're not cold currently, it's actually quite a difficult thing to imagine that you will be cold in the future, because what you have to do is appreciate that the current state of your mind and the current state of your body is actually just one way that it could be.
Yeah.
And that in the future, it might be different.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of metacognitive process where you have to actually disengage from the present and simulate an alternative to reality. This is maybe just one of the reasons, like, when people get frustrated with their kids for not really not appreciating these things, well, just consider how complicated for the, it is for the brain to be able to achieve that, what the steps that it has to go through.
Mm-hmm.
And all these different cognitive capacities kind of working in tandem to make that happen.
Yeah. I mean, even I'll give this a kind of another tangible example of in the clinical world is, one of the things I'll tell, clients and stuff is, folks that have various cognitive distortions or some of these negative thoughts, I'll say, well, that's not necessarily wrong, right? And there might be something in that, but you're looking at something that needs a 360 view. Have you thought about looking at it this way, this way, this way, this way, this way, this way, this way? It's like, if you witness a robbery on the street, someone gets held up and they get their, purse stolen or whatever. Well, if you're behind the person that's this happening, you have one vantage point and it's going to look a certain way. But if you're across the street in the building on the 7th floor and you look down and you see this happening, well, it's going to look, you're going to see the same event, but it's going to look wildly different. Right. So either for our own lives or when we're observing others, it's how do we say, well, wait a minute, I have this one kind of, we all have this trait negativity bias of sorts, but it's like, okay, I'm going to see it this one way, but can I imagine other perspectives and other ways of doing things?
Nice.
And what that can look like sort of in the near future and what that does, then you're saying, well, okay, well, that's a little bit different now. And then now if I see it, kind of the whole thing, it's almost like looking at like, a quarter of a picture. If you look at the whole picture and given the context, oh, well, that looks totally different now. And I wonder if in a practical sense, that's important to do.
Yeah, it must be. And also probably the utility of seeing how people came to where they are now.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Like appreciating the various journeys that people have had that have taken them to the present moment, and then the way that they interact with you as a result of that, and kind of appreciating it, not so much as, okay, this person is like an obstacle in my way, but that this person has their own life story. And this one, it connects to one of the things we mentioned a little while ago about the kind of costs and benefits of having this mental time machine. Is that it also is responsible for our regrets.
Oh, yeah.
And, taking a spin into an alternative timeline where we did things better than we could have done otherwise.
Certainly. I mean, look, I mean, I have, fun arguments with some of my colleagues about this, but this is, I think, some of the adaptive qualities of shame, right? We don't like shame, right? We don't like jealousy, but emotions aren't good or bad. They are, right? They can make us feel poorly or not so well, but in and of themselves, they don't have a valence in this way inherently, I don't think. And shame is something that I think in small doses can be really adaptive for us, because it can be like, yeah, you remember that feeling? Remember how that feels? How can we have better pro-social interactions where we're not doing those same things, right? I don't think we should have, walking around wanting to feel all this shame as a reminder, but I think in small moments or for certain things, it can be it's almost, I would say, like maybe not quite the same. It's because it's about the self and what that is and all that and our sense of self, but much like in the same way as disgust is almost a visceral kind of reaction. And that helps us, not put pathogens in us, whatever it may be. I feel like shame is a kind of maybe a more abstract or more emotional kind of system as well, where it's like, yeah, remember how that feels or what that's like, and how it kind of gets to your, to your bones or to your core of who you are. And how can you use that to then push yourself to not, do that or to feel, that way again? I think in small moments or in increments can be adaptive, right? Which is as a rabbit trail. I mean, I won't go down, but I absolutely, detest when people say you just need to get rid of your shame and you need to just be more vulnerable and just get rid of the shame of your life as if it's some kind of sinful nature or something. It's preposterous. It's an emotion,
Yeah. I mean, it puts me in mind of Randy Nessie's work. Do you know Randy Nessie's? Yeah, it's great. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a fantastic kind of evolutionary approach to psychiatry and clinical psychology, which, actively attempting to recognize exactly, what you were just getting at. These things are complicated, evolved social emotions that have particular functions for regulating behavior in primate groups. That's one way of thinking about them. And then you say, well, how are they manifesting in your life today? And then you can start to maybe as you were getting at, I mean, I'm no clinician, but you could say, okay, well, in what way are they serving you? And in what way are they becoming actively harmful? But not just throwing out the baby with the bathwater and saying, okay, because anxiety feels bad, it is therefore something to be banished. Instead, it's like it's embracing it. It's okay, we're going to feel anxious. You have this emotion, and it probably serves some useful functions. And then what can you take from it? What can you learn, and what can you move past and avoid? It's really unrealistic. It's unrealistic to imagine that the things that make us feel bad are just going to be, in any way that we could just remove them entirely from our lives. It's not going to happen.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
No, it's not. And even if we had the ability to do it, I don't know if we should. That's a different question and maybe a different conversation. But I'm not too sure if that would be the right thing. I think that's part of the human experience.
No, I mean, anxiety is really a case in point. I've done a little bit of work on looking at anxiety as a evolved system. And you could say, to what extent do animals feel anxiety? To what extent do they have fear? And then you could say, well, how does this emotion interact with our ability to anticipate the future? Because anxiety is, fundamentally future oriented in the sense that you're anticipating what could go wrong, and trying to work around it. On the one hand, you can say anxiety is useful in the sense that it prepares you, it motivates you to tackle a threat that you would otherwise not care about. So as I mentioned earlier, people discount the future partly because it's hard to imagine. So if the future is very difficult to imagine, it's very difficult to connect with, and it's also very uncertain. So it's very tempting to not care about that future. One thing anxiety does is it actually gives you the emotional salience to motivate you to care about a future event that you otherwise might ignore. And so it acts as Robert Frank has this great idea about emotions being commitment devices that
that's nice.
Actively lock you in to behaviors and actions that you otherwise wouldn't pursue because you would lack the motivational salience. It wouldn't matter to you. And there are various. He gives various other examples. So even something like love. It's like, well, you're investing now, and the love is the thing that motivates you to pursue this. Despite the obstacles that will come about. And anxiety may be similar. I think that the archetypal example is anger. So the example he gives is like, so it's really important to seem like a credible threat in an interpersonal threatening situation where you need to be credible in the sense that if someone does something to you, like rob you, well, then you need to be credibly willing to retaliate. That's the concept in kind of evolutionary context. But that retaliation is only really credible if you would then go on to commit the retaliation, even though once the harm is done, it's no longer in your best interest to actually risk the damage of the retaliation. So let's say, someone robs me, and now my possession is gone. What is the benefit of me now retaliating against them and putting myself at further risk? Well, his argument is that from a cool-headed kind of analysis, maybe you wouldn't. So what you need instead is an evolved biological system, namely in this case, anger, which incentivizes and commits you to retaliation, even when it's no longer in your rational best interest from a short-term perspective to actually do it. Because what it does instead is it helps build your broader reputation.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit. It's really, 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 really nice. Do you know the work by Laith Al-Shawaf? I've
seen some of his. I've read some of his articles. Really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, he's a friend, and he's not only is he a great thinker and scholar and does really good research. He's an exceptional writer, and he's one of the best people I know at explaining evolutionary concepts. I mean, he's a
I read his article recently on parasites. It's just great. Brilliant.
It's
really fantastic.
He's a great writer. He's a great communicator. And I know he was doing some work. I think he was doing work on some of the emotional evolutionary aspects of emotions. I think he was looking at hunger as well in there. And so he's done some work kind of sort of in this space analogously, maybe. So it sounds like
interesting. I should check that out.
Yeah,
I think that Robert. I was just going to say that Robert Frank argument about the emotions as commitment devices it's a very elegant idea that actually resolves some of the paradoxes about why emotions function the way they do. And so that's why I've always found that book. I think it's called Passion Within Reason. It's one of my favorites. It's brilliant.
Yeah. I don't remember which. It was somewhere early-ish on, maybe in episode 40-ish, or I don't remember, somewhere around there, where Laith and I had at least a 2.5 hour conversation. We talked about a lot of this stuff, and his one of the articles that still gets passed around. It's such a really good article. Is one he wrote about why the Myers-Briggs is bullshit. It's a great article.
The personality test.
Yes. It's a great article.
Nice.
Yeah, we had a nice conversation. So he's great. Okay, so just a little bit about the brain here in terms of foresight. So, you talk about the default mode network, you talk about the frontal parietal control network, and how these areas are important for maps of external reality, conceptual relationships, and in the future. Maybe just kind of give us the, brain for dummies of those areas, and then how it's important in foresight in the future.
Yeah, so one of the key things is that the systems involved in mental time travel, both into the past in memory and into the future in foresight, are very distributed across the entire brain. It seems to, it's much more popular now in neuroscience and probably much more accurate to think of the brain in terms of wide scale networks, where multiple regions are all cooperating and coordinating together to achieve some function. With that said, it is possible to identify particular very important parts of the brain, and one of them is the hippocampus, that are essential for foresight foresight and mental time travel, really in either direction. And so a good example of this being very starkly put forward is there are patients, including one who goes in the literature by the name of KC, who damage that part of the brain. The hippocampus gets damaged either via direct brain damage. In KC's case, it was a motorcycle accident, but in other cases, it can be through infection, and the damage to the hippocampus can actually completely obliterate the ability to revisit specific episodes from one's life in memory, as well as the ability to imagine the future. And so KC, he retained semantic information. So he knew facts about his life. He knew his own name, and he also retained procedural information, but he could not imagine any event from his own life that had happened to him in the past. And he could also not imagine anything whatsoever that might happen to him in the future, despite having knowledge about that future.
Oh, it's terrible.
So yeah, I know it really is. It's, yeah. And this patient KC was worked with a lot by Endel Tulving, who really actually used this case study as one of the key lines of evidence to fractionate memory into its different components, episodic and semantic. When they asked him, what is it like when you try to imagine the future? He would just say, I can't do it. It's kind of like how you said a minute ago, when you try to imagine 100 years into the future, he's just drawing a blank. But that would be the case for him, even if he was asked to imagine what he might do tomorrow. He's just drawing a complete blank. And then they asked him for a metaphor at one point. What's it like? What's it really like? He said it's something like it's like swimming in the middle of a lake. There's nothing there to hold you up. Just kind of just a sort of void. And this reveals, it's a fascinating human story, but it also reveals something very interesting about the brain, namely that there are these kind of central nodes, and in particular the hippocampus, which communicates with much of the rest of the brain in order to bring about this mental theater production that you use to envisage what might happen.
Yeah, I think I like the first part that you said, that we now look at the brain as, for a long time it was, there are these, this part of the brain does this and this part of the brain does this, very kind of localized. But thankfully, we now see that the brain is a series of networks. And yes, there are maybe certain aspects that do a primary function, but, so like language, language might be in Broca's or Wernicke's areas, but language is also everywhere in the brain, right? There's all of these types of interactions that are going on. That's
right. Yeah. And you think about something like those areas and even the hippocampus, if it gets damaged, that doesn't mean that therefore mental time travel is, that the hippocampus does mental time travel.
Right.
What it means is that when by damaging that, you've also damaged the connectivity between that part of the brain and the rest of the brain.
Yeah. And
so it might be a central node, for example, in the network that actually brings about this ability when you combine it whole scale.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely.
And then when you actually sort of try to pin down some of these networks, you say, okay, well, one of the key networks, which many people will have heard of, is the default mode network. And it's so named because when you put people in an fMRI scanner and you ask them to do nothing, or you have it, it's the between times between tasks, this is the network that becomes active. And one thing that I mentioned earlier, when you meditate, you reveal this to yourself. What are you doing when an experimenter tells you to lie in a dark, loud metal tube and do nothing? Well, your mind is wandering. And what you're probably doing is revisiting things that have happened to you in the past, contemplating the minds of other people and thinking about what you have to do. Is my gym membership expiring, and what's for dinner and this kind of stuff, or worrying, unfortunately. And so this default mode network has been very much closely associated with mental time travel. And when scientists subsequently put people in fMRI scanners and explicitly asked them to imagine future events or remember events that have happened to them in the past, what they found was that many of the same brain regions are active in those two conditions, and that those brain regions overlap with the default mode network, which is perhaps not surprising given that what people tend to default to when they're doing nothing else is thinking about themselves in the past and future.
Yeah. So let's revisit the idea of tools, and we can use the example of fire, but I just want to know, how does foresight help with new technology and also with social dynamics? This is in the latter part of the book, I believe. How in our evolutionary past, and you can bring it up to the present, how do tools and fire and how we use things in the evolution of foresight help for sociality and building new things?
Yeah, maybe we can kick off where we left off earlier when I was going through the broad, the 30,000 feet view of the evolutionary story. Where we got to thinking about something like an Acheulean hand axe. As you move forward further in time, you start to get more complicated technologies, things like compound tools, where you're no longer just chipping flakes off of a stone, removing something from a core, but now you're combining together different elements to make something that does a job that is not just one object, it's combined. So for example, hafting a stone spear tip onto a wooden handle. That's an example of a development in foresight that it requires the vision to say, okay, I've got this object here, I've got this other object here. I could actually combine these two things in my mind's eye and put them together. So you have this kind of imagination of what it could look like, and it's really quite a complicated process, to haft something onto a wooden handle. So that's just an example.
Can I, with that example,
please, yeah.
So, like, is there? It would seem that like a lot of things are at play, though, and so I guess I want to know specifically where foresight is, but then how it plays around with other ideas. So I could see perception, experience, and then intelligence, right? Because then it's like, well, I've done this enough times and this isn't working. So now I need to like put this onto this. Like that's I mean, if you take the intelligence,
right. I mean, one way of defining intelligence, and Steven Pinker has put it this way in the past, is that it's the use of rational means to achieve goals. And a goal, in essence, is a future directed cognitive phenomenon. You have to appreciate what you're trying to achieve in order for intelligence to really come in to help you achieve it. The example of the wooden handle being attached to a stone spear tip, if you're lucky, maybe you walk into a clearing and right in front of you is both a piece of stone and a great looking stick and the twine that I need to haft them together, and maybe the materials I'm going to use to make glue. But that won't happen. Instead, what you need is to gather the various different component pieces. Imagine in your mind's eye, keeping all the time in mind the end goal, and then bring all those different components together, figure out a plan of action to attach them, and then build this final product, which you're then not even anticipating. You're not even going to use it right now because it takes a lot of time to build. So they weren't making them, when they were in a pickle, you needed it straight away. They were making a spear that would only really later end up, jabbed inside of a horse that they were trying to hunt. And so that's the ways that foresight is involved. And as you say, it's combined with all these different elements of sociality as well, because this is not really an ability you can learn wholesale by yourself. It's a culturally evolved practice.
I didn't, when I read the book, this didn't yell out at me. And it's even when I was preparing this, but it does seem as if foresight is, I don't want to say essential part. That sounds too prescriptive, but it seems like it's a big part of intelligence. And that's not to say that foresight is in, you can see it in other animals that maybe are or not intelligent. I mean, I mean, that's a different question, I guess, but it just seems to really, really ride along together in the same car is what it seems like.
Yeah, highly overlapping. As I said a minute ago, if you're using intelligence to achieve a goal, you've anticipated what you're trying to achieve, and then foresight. I mean, is another way of looking at it. If you're intelligent, you have the capacity to be wise. You have the capacity, but you're not necessarily going to actually achieve that. And likewise, foresight. If you can imagine the future, you may lack the intelligence to actually pursue the visions that you might anticipate. What's interesting is you have all these IQ tests. You have a lot of different ways of measuring intelligence. As far as I know, there is no psychometric test of foresight. Even though this is a very central ability and it's tied up in intelligence. But as far as I know, there is no well-validated test of the ability to imagine future events and work towards achieving them. You have measures of planning and executive function. So, for example, you have to, build a tower out of smaller elements. And so that's an element of foresight.
Right.
But this thing that KC lost, right, the ability to actually imagine the future and anticipate what's going to happen. I don't, to my knowledge, that's not being really studied.
Not directly to my, nothing's yelling at me. I know there's some theory of mind stuff that's given out. Drawing a blank on some of the names, but
like you have the false belief task. You can measure if a child is that kind of thing. Yeah.
I know there's like the I'm forgetting how it all works, but there's like the Iowa gambling task, which is basically gambling. And so there's some element of like, well, if this happens, then this will happen in this scenario, in this situation, then I'll lose this amount of, credits or money or whatever the scenario is. So there's things that kind of get at elements of it, but directly, I don't think so. I could be wrong on that.
Yeah. But. No, we obviously we sort of looked into this, and one of the major lines of my academic research has been using intertemporal choice tasks, which are, and like, again, it's sort of analogous to this Iowa gambling task that you just mentioned, in that it measures a particular aspect of future directed cognition. And in this case, we give people choices like, would you rather have $10 now or $15 in a month?
Right.
You ask many different questions like that, and you vary both the amounts of money and the time delay to the outcome.
Right.
And what you can do is then you can compute that person's preference function. And you can say that, for a given person, as time increases, how much does the reward, in this case, lose its subjective value? And then the question is, how steeply does it lose its subjective value? Namely, with each additional unit of time, how much more does the value of the item decline in its value to me personally? And that's very idiosyncratic. So some people very steeply discount the future, where as soon as something's out of sight and out of mind, it's out of mind, and they will always prefer what they can get now. And some people have a very shallow discounting function, which is to say that events in the future, rewards in the future, are given a very similar weighting in terms of their value to events and to outcomes that happen now in the present. And the shape of one's discounting function has implications for various different things, the way you interact with the world, and also has kind of policy implications as well when we come to questions around how much we should value things that are delayed in time.
This doesn't, again, get at foresight, but there's an element of time. So there's a projective measure called the thematic apperception test, the TAT, and basically you show a picture. So usually they're kind of antiquated now, old pictures, but you show somebody a picture and you say, and they're kind of ambiguous, right? There's, somebody lying on a table and there's somebody watching over, or somebody next to the table, just kind of looking at them on the table. And so you tell the person, tell me a story about what's happening in the picture, and make sure to tell me what the people are feeling, and tell me the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. So what happens in the beginning, what happens in the middle, and definitely tell me the end. And if they don't tell you or they forget, you make note of that. But then you say, and what happens at the end? Well, at the end, they just fall off and they die, or there's some, or like, well, I don't know what happens. They just go on the next day, or, and all of these. The idea is that it's a projective to see people give the most fascinating stories, but it's projective to just see like totally, clean slate. Where do they go in their mind? It can tell you,
interesting,
not anything definitively, but it can tell you, hints or ideas about their personality, because there is elements of personality of like, if I look at a picture like that, I'm like, well, this is what happens and how I tell it and all these things. Whereas if you or someone else looks at it, I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, this person looks like there's some that are cued that way. There's someone standing on a bridge. It's like, well,
okay,
are they going to jump? Or are they just looking at the sunset?
This is like a clinical tool.
Yeah. So when you do psychological assessments,
Okay, I see.
You do a battery, a standard battery for, personality, social cognitive functioning, social emotional functioning. You might use a projective. The Rorschach is another projective.
A projective, yeah, interesting.
And then you have objective measures of personality, such as an MMPI 3 or a TA or a PAI or an MCMI or things like that. And maybe some self-report measures. So these are standardized ways of looking at clinical syndromes, things like that. So anyways, the TAT has elements of, so kind of going to the point I was making earlier, where someone can think about what people in a story or a picture that's made up can think about their future and how things end, because he'll say like, well, he's thinking about this. There's like, I think there's like a picture there where it's like, there's very strange pictures. Somebody's in a room and someone's opening the door kind of a crack and she has like a surprised look on her face. And so it's ambiguous enough where it could be the person's surprised, they're yelling, they're upset, they're in hysterics, they're, someone's startled. I mean, it could be a million things. It's ambiguous enough in that way. And so then what the person will say is pulling for how they're perceiving something. And then it's, well, here's what happened. She was coming up the stairs and she had just made breakfast. And it's a whole story. And the story doesn't really matter in terms of like, it's not a right or wrong thing. It's more of where does the person go in their mind? And then how do they tell the story? And then how does it end? Sometimes they'll do things. Some accounts will, certain pictures will say. So, and then she's thinking about, 10 days later when blah, 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 blah happens. And so it depends on the person and how they bring the story, but you must have a beginning, middle, and end, and then what they're thinking and feeling, things like that. So
I'm not really kind of clued in with the personality literature all that well, but you mentioned earlier that there's that one. So what, as far as I understand it, the kind of the big five is generally understood to be like kind of most psychometrically valid way of tackling it. Yeah. So where does something like this projectives fit in? Yeah.
So projectives so the TAT is I've given the TAT. I would never use it to definitively say something about a person's personality.
It gives you clues.
Yeah, it's an adjunctive. It's a tertiary kind of way to give more, if you will, like think of it like seasoning on a meal.
Bit more color to it. Yeah.
Yeah, where it's like, okay, like, here's the standard profile. You give a big 5, you give an MMPI 3, you give all the very standard psychometrically sound measures, but then you want to give, there's elements of those things where people, will know they're being asked a question. They know they're being measured. They know. So with a projective, it's just, okay, you just want me to tell a story? Okay. And so it's a way of just kind of like, you don't put a lot of stock into it in terms of like the psychometrics, but it can say a lot of the times, which is fascinating, you'll just see this continuity. It's like, wow, like a lot of the stuff that was on the projective is consistent with all the themes we saw with the objective measures. So there's consistency. And sometimes where it's not, you can then see on the objective measures, are they bullshitting here? Were they like trying to make themselves look good? And then you can see that and like, oh, interesting. So then we get a little bit more of the real. So like for very kind of guarded defensive clients where they don't want to say or answer one way or the other, you can say like, well, what does this picture look like? And again, you're not going to determine their whole personality based off that, but it can give you, it's another window in to say, there's something here thematically is basically.
I mean, I've always found it interesting to think, and this is no slight against people doing personality research or anything like that, but the idea that you would be able to, collapse the nebulous nature of someone's personality down into, a string of numbers based on, their responses to a series of survey questions. On the one hand, it's amazing that it works as well as it does, because on the face of it, you'd think, well, I mean, that's amazing. Like you could, that something so rich and nebulous as that can be condensed in a way that then does correlate with real world outcomes. But on the other hand, you think, well, what is missing from that? And this is true broadly in psychology as a discipline.
Sure.
As a whole, and this area of foresight and mental time travel is no different. There's it's very difficult to get a handle on something so complex as like someone's mind. And so in the case of personality, it's always just seemed particularly stark, because when you get to know someone on a person to person level, there is just so much going on, and so much richness and so much history in someone's mind Yeah.
But the thing that becomes really interesting if you're, a good psychologist is you start to find big themes pretty quickly. You do the interview, you get their history, maybe you talk to some relatives or, whatever, collateral sources. And then you start to look at their behavioral observations, how they are. If you have multiple interactions with them, you start to notice themes. And then you give the objective measures, or maybe you give the big five. Maybe you give a PAI, and then you give some of the projectives, and then you give some of the self-report measures. So it's the confluence of all of these data points where you can say, yeah, there's no way I can know everything about a person's personality. But here are some really big themes that we know. Like, it's not hard to say, like, this person's pretty guarded. They're pretty defensive. It's not hard to say, hey, you know what? And again, you would caveat that in these contexts, in these situations, it's more likely than not that they could have this because of X, Y, and Z, or potentially these reasons. But it's never a definitive, look, people still have these debates about cognition. Right? What's really G? How can we have an IQ score? And what is that really about? They're good attempts. They're psychometrically sound attempts, but, I don't think you can ever really, kind of pin someone down to, right.
I suppose on some level it's like, okay, you could treat it as a useful reductive tool. You can say with personality variables or anything else, you can say, okay, this does not, you can't reify it and say, well, this is the thing. Obviously, you can't confuse the measure for the thing that it's measuring, but you can use it for what it's worth, and you can say, okay, it's useful in these different ways. It's a tool like anything else. Yeah. And actually, in this area in foresight and stuff, that there are attempts to do that in social psychology. Like Phil Zimbardo has come up with this time perspective inventory, looking at different ways of the way that people relate to the future. You could be like a present hedonist, and you want to be in the present and stuff. But as we put it in the book, I think that's exactly the right mindset. Say, okay, that might be a useful tool. It gives you some clues. It gives you a sense of how people vary. But people are so flexible.
Yes.
And they are so general in their abilities, and they differ so drastically based on context and and interactions they've had, and they change so much as well. That all of those things are, they are only really tentative in some sense. Like you have to put that big caveat around it, and especially the case with foresight, because one of the things we argue is that foresight, it is ultimately it's one of the key capacities that enables us to specialize. Because it's a general cognitive function, like being able to anticipate the future, but it gives you the ability to, for example, practice to become better at one specific thing because you've anticipated the payoff that will come from doing that. And so there's really it's very, very difficult to say, okay, what a given person is going to use this general cognitive capacity to actually do. People, as we talked about earlier, little children, they will acquire the generalist capacity for foresight, but then what they will apply that towards will vary dramatically between individuals. And so, when you meet someone, you just don't know what they are really good at when you first meet them, because they've used their foresight, or they've been taught by someone else using their foresight to acquire a particular expertise to a particular high level, which they'll then use in different ways. Just a sort of fine point on the personality thing.
This is why we can't, kind of what you're saying. We're a multivariate bag here, and it makes it. Yeah, you don't need to read that much into this. You don't, need PhDs like you and I have, or whatever, to know this. It's one of those things where it's, in a practical sense, when people try to reduce people to like one or two things, it just makes no sense. Just on the face validity of it, it's just like, come on, that people are complicated, right? Like, this person did a thing, or sure, maybe
like he's a hothead, or she's selfish, or anything else like that.
It's wild. It's like, maybe in that context, or maybe there's an aspect of them, but it's like, come on, we can't really know all of these things about an entire person. But Okay, so one of the last few things here is, interestingly enough, I mean, I guess we haven't talked about it directly, is we haven't talked about clock time, which is interesting. We've kind of sort of alluded to it or in certain examples, but how did we learn how to make clock time of sorts, and the tools to capture clock time? Maybe here you can talk about the significance of Mullepin and how writing was important for time and foresight.
Yeah, I mean, we probably don't have time to necessarily get into all the details here, but sure. Chapter 7 of the book, we do exactly that. We sort of say, okay, you have this ability to relate to the future. What are some of the tools and artifacts? Not things like spears, which you anticipate that you'll need them in the future and you build them now, but tools and artifacts that actually themselves help us get a better grasp of the future. And calendars are a great example. Clocks, obviously. But maybe we'll take calendars as a starting point. Hunter-gatherer groups have oral calendars, and they have ways of splitting up the day. They have ways of splitting up time. There's a relation to when certain food is going to become available, seasonal changes. There's many patterns in nature which are extremely they're available to be taken advantage of and discretized and made into a pattern which you can use personally to, for example, organize when you're going to hunt a certain animal. Obviously, then you get things like lunar calendars, which are about tracking the movement of the moon, the phases of the moon. What we point out is that much of the time these things these calendars are coming about as people invent writing. One of the things they're using writing for is making accounts initially, like who owes what to whom and when the bill is due. But then they're also using it slightly later to get a handle on time itself and to sort of slowly but surely discretize time down and get a better handle on what's going to happen. So, for example, it's much easier for you and I to coordinate our social activities if we can agree on a particular day in the future when it's going to happen. It's a better plan to meet up at a particular moon phase, for example, rather than just to say, I'll see you in a bit. And one of the things that we point out, Mullepin is a Babylonian star compendium. It's a great example of a early written compendium of the passage of stars and the understanding of the patterns and in time that are going to occur in the future and this kind of thing. But it was also used for divination and making plannings of oracles and all of the bad things that would occur if a particular omen occurred in the sky, this kind of thing. And that's the common theme. So with many of these early invented calendrical systems, what comes along for the ride is a kind of superstitious or magical thinking about the future. And of course, divination is something absolutely central to human affairs. Like you look basically across every human group, it ultimately stems from the same underlying driver, which is a recognition that the future is full of mutually exclusive possibilities and an attempt to get to grips with that and to try and make it more concrete, to predict what's going to happen. And so it just so happens that before you have something like the invention of science, it's incredibly difficult to discern what are the predictive processing, what are the calendrical and the predictive processes that actually work and will enable us to predict, for example, when the next eclipse is going to happen. And what are the predictive calendrical systems that do not actually work, but seem like they do? For instance, that predict using the passage of a star, whether our crops will fail or not. And to give credit to these people, it's actually extremely difficult to tell those things apart before you have a systematic way of testing ideas. Give an example of Isaac Newton coming up with incredibly sophisticated new ideas that revolutionize our sense of our place in space and time, but also pursuing the philosopher's dream, the philosopher's stone, for a long time. And on the one hand, you say, okay, it's actually not that crazy when you think that for a while he actually was the only one in the world who had discovered this invisible force linking together objects across distant spaces, this gravity. And so he was in possession of this kind of arcane knowledge about the relationship of different celestial bodies with each other and the movement of. So it's really not that far fetched to think, well, maybe it's also possible that X, Y, Z, and you can just come up with however many superstitious ideas you want. So yeah, no, it's very interesting to think about the different ways that people have used foresight to try and get to grips with the future, both in ways that actually work and ways that don't work, at least not as advertised.
Yeah. So my last question here is, what are the, I guess, strengths and weaknesses of foresight? We've mentioned it a little bit in the conversation, but for us as humans, there's some good stuff. There's maybe some not so good stuff. And how do you think we continue to evolve, our skills of prediction and foresight in the future?
So at a very big picture level, I think the strengths, one important thing to recognize about the strengths of our foresight is that we are probably the only animal that has ever existed that has this kind of access to the fourth dimension. So unlike any species that has come before us or that exists right now, we alone have access to the future in this way. And that also means we are the only ones really responsible for it. This gives us this gives us a custodianship over the planet, because we have this incredibly powerful and strong ability to imagine what's going to happen, mutually exclusive possibilities, very distant, remote times and places, and then change our current behavior accordingly. So that's to say, okay, there's a very powerful ability. We need to know how it works and how to use it better, because ultimately this is a very strong capacity, but it also has a lot of flaws. It's not clairvoyance, as we just mentioned a moment ago. Plenty of ways that we've gotten it wrong. And so the weaknesses of our foresight are many. On the one hand, you could, for example, just simply mispredict what's going to happen, both at that really small time scale that we mentioned earlier, where I accidentally turn my car into someone else's car and we have a crash, or that I mispredict how someone will react to, for example, a surprise birthday party, and I've just gotten it wrong. So there's that kind of weakness. There's also the weaknesses in putting our plans into action. So you could have excellent, very well detailed, specific idea of what you're trying to achieve, and then fail in the execution, which is also a critical part of actually making foresight. In order for foresight to be useful in any way, we have to be able to put it into action. So those are just kind of two ways of thinking about the strengths and weaknesses. How we end the book, and maybe to kind of wrap up on your last question as well about how this is going to continue to evolve and change. What we argue is that what we really, really need is just a deeper humility about our ability to foresee the future. Because that ability to say, okay, this is just a fictitious imagining of what could happen, but I could be wrong, is critical. Just like the kids in the tube task, right? Or if they put two hands out under each of the exits, they guarantee that they're going to succeed.
Right.
That's a very rudimentary form of contingency planning, but at a broad scale level, both individually and societally, we have to recognize that we are not going to make our predictions are not going to be 100% spot on, and we have to entertain alternatives. We have to entertain contingencies, and ultimately that stems from just being humble about this extremely powerful capacity that we have. Yeah.
No, that's great. Well, the book is called The Invention of Tomorrow, A Natural History of Foresight. It's out everywhere. Where can people find yourself and maybe some of your co-authors? Best place to get at you guys?
So there's a website for the book. And so if you just Google The Invention of Tomorrow, that'll come up. I'm on Twitter at Adam D. Bulley, Bulley. The audiobook has just come out as well. So nice. I'm not reading it, so you don't have to sit through another 2 hours of me rambling at you. There's a fantastic English actor, Philip Batley, who read it, and he did a brilliant job. In fact, I almost think the audio is the definitive version of the book now. He did such a good job of reading it. I was like, this is better than I even thought it. We could have done it. Yeah. So
that's great. That's great. Well, look, Adam, I mean, it's so much fun talking to you about it. I mean, I love the book. It was great. I talked to colleagues that have also read it and loved it. So it was really nice to talk to you about all of these topics, and it was very stimulating and fantastic conversation. So
likewise. No, it was a real pleasure, and really appreciate it. The questions were super interesting, and it really got the gears turning. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you.